What if the most important thing about 70,000 plantain seedlings is not how many bananas they can produce, but what happens after those bananas leave the field? That is the question now facing Burkina Faso. In October 2024, 70,000 plantain seedlings were handed over to producers under the country's Presidential Agricultural Initiative. The initial plan covered at least 42 hectares. On the surface, this may look like another agricultural distribution program, but behind those young plants is a much larger test of whether Burkina Faso can move from importing food toward producing more of it at home, and eventually keeping more of the economic value created by that production. Because growing the fruit is only the beginning. A farmer needs reliable water, fertilizer, healthy planting material, and technical knowledge. Once the plantain is harvested, another chain begins. Someone must collect it, transport it, store it, sell it, or process it before the fruit spoils. And that raises an even bigger question. If Burkina Faso succeeds in producing more plantain, will it simply sell fresh bunches from the field, or can those harvests eventually support local storage, transport, packaging, and food processing businesses? That distinction matters. It determines whether agriculture creates income mainly on the farm or creates another layer of jobs after the harvest. If you follow the changing economic story of Africa beyond the headlines, stay with this channel, because this is exactly the kind of development worth watching over time. President Ibrahim Traore has placed food self-sufficiency and domestic production at the center of his government's agricultural agenda. But 70,000 seedlings alone cannot prove that the strategy has succeeded. The real evidence will come later. We must follow those seedlings from the nursery to the farm, from irrigation to harvest, and from the roadside market to storage and processing. Because the larger ambition is not simply to grow a plantain in Burkina Faso. It is to discover how much of the value created by that plantain can remain in Burkina Faso. The first question is whether those 70,000 seedlings ever became more than a government announcement. The evidence suggests that at least in several production areas they did. The program began publicly in October 2024 when 70,000 plantain seedlings were handed over to growers. The initial deployment was expected to cover at least 42 hectares. Producers were not supposed to receive planting material alone. Technical assistance and agricultural inputs were also part of the effort. By June 2025, there was something more important to examine than promises. Plantain grown under the initiative was already being harvested in parts of Burkina Faso. In Kenedougou province, about 7,500 plantain sackers had been planted across roughly 3.5 hectares. Officials reported that producers were beginning to harvest fruit grown on Burkinabe soil. At Diaradougou, one producer reported potential yields of approximately 30 to 35 tons per hectare. That figure deserves attention but also caution. It comes from a particular production site. It should not be presented as the national average for Burkina Faso. The program also continued beyond its original distribution. By 2026, reports from the Guirico region described an experimental farm reaching its fifth harvest, while the number of plantain plants distributed to producers was reported to have expanded beyond the original 70,000. Another development may prove equally important. Planting material that initially had connections to supplies from neighboring Ghana was increasingly being multiplied through nurseries inside Burkina Faso. That matters because agricultural independence is not only about where the final fruit grows. It also concerns where farmers obtain the material needed to begin the next production cycle. Still, these results should not be exaggerated. A successful farm is not the same thing as a successful national industry. Several thousand productive plants do not prove that Burkina Faso can yet supply its entire domestic market. What they do provide is evidence of something more modest but essential. The experiment has moved from seedlings on paper to plantains being harvested from the soil. Now comes the harder test. Whether that early success can be repeated, expanded, and sustained across a much larger production system. Why does this plantain program matter economically when 70,000 seedlings are still small compared with the needs of an entire country? The answer begins at the border. In 2024, Burkina Faso imported approximately 11.6 million kilograms of bananas and plantains combined. Most came from neighboring Ghana, with another portion coming from Ivory Coast. This figure does not mean Burkina Faso imported 11.6 million kilograms of plantain alone, because the international trade category combines bananas and plantains. But it reveals something important. There is already domestic demand being supplied partly by producers outside the country. Every kilogram successfully replaced by competitive local production represents more than food grown at home. It can also mean money circulating through Burkinabe farms, workers, transporters, and businesses instead of paying exclusively for production elsewhere. Now consider the original 42 hectares. At one production site in Diaradougou, potential yields were reported at roughly 30 to 35 tons per hectare. If, purely for illustration, all 42 hectares achieved that level, they could theoretically produce between 1,260 and 1,470 tons. That is not an official harvest forecast. Conditions differ from one farm to another, and the reported yield from one location cannot simply be treated as a national average. But the calculation gives us perspective. The first 42 hectares were never large enough by themselves to transform Burkina Faso into a major banana power. Their greater value may be as a demonstration of whether production can be expanded economically, and replacing imports is not as simple as growing the same number of kilograms at home. Local plantains must reach consumers at the right time, in acceptable condition, and at a competitive price. Farmers must produce consistently. Transport must work. Traders must have access to the harvest. So the real question is not whether Burkina Faso can plant enough trees to produce an impressive photograph. It is whether domestic production can become reliable enough to capture a meaningful share of an existing market. If that happens, plantain becomes more than another crop. It becomes one small test of whether money once leaving Burkina Faso to purchase food can increasingly circulate through the hands of its own producers. But producing more plantain exposes a harder reality. A seedling cannot survive on political ambition alone. It needs water, nutrients, healthy soil, technical knowledge, and months of consistent care. Water may be the most important test. Burkina Faso operates in a difficult climate where much agricultural production remains vulnerable to rainfall. Plantain needs dependable moisture, especially if producers expect stable harvest rather than one successful season. Farmers involved in the program have already raised access to water as one of their concerns. This is why the wider agricultural strategy matters. Burkina Faso has been rehabilitating dams, developing irrigated areas, installing pumps, and trying to expand production beyond the rainy season. These projects are not all dedicated to plantain, and it would be misleading to present them that way. But they address the same structural weakness that plantain growers face. The government has also distributed subsidized fertilizer, improved seeds, tractors, tillers, pumps, and other agricultural equipment across the broader farming sector. Technical officers are intended to help producers apply better farming practices. This reveals something important about food sovereignty. It is not achieved simply because the crop grows inside national borders. Imagine Burkina Faso replacing imported fruit while remaining heavily dependent on imported fertilizer, fuel, machinery, or replacement parts. The country would have reduced one dependency while leaving several others untouched. That does not make the planting program meaningless. It shows that self-sufficiency comes in stages. First, farmers learn to grow the crop successfully. Then local nurseries can reduce dependence on imported planting material. Better irrigation can reduce dependence on rainfall. Stronger local supply systems can gradually reduce vulnerability to external shocks. Each step removes another weak point. For Ibrahim Traore's agricultural strategy, this is where the difference between a campaign and a transformation will eventually become visible. Giving farmers seedlings can start production. Keeping those farms productive year after year requires functioning infrastructure and institutions behind them. And even if Burkina Faso solves all of these problems on the farm, the challenge does not end there. The moment a mature bunch of plantain is cut from the plant, a different clock begins ticking. Now the country must find a way to move it, preserve its quality, and sell it before time destroys the value farmers worked so hard to create. The moment plantain leaves the field, the problem changes. The farmer is no longer asking whether the crop will grow. The question becomes whether someone can buy it before its value begins to disappear. Plantain is perishable. It cannot be treated like a sack of dry grain that can simply sit for months while the owner waits for a better price. Once harvested, handling, temperature, transportation, and time become increasingly important. This creates a danger that often appears after agricultural production expands. Imagine several farming areas reaching harvest at roughly the same time. More bunches arrive at local markets, but the number of buyers, trucks, storage facilities, and distribution routes has not increased at the same speed. Farmers may have produced exactly what the government encouraged them to produce, yet suddenly face pressure to sell quickly and cheaply. That is why Burkina Faso's plantain producers raised the issue of market access from the early stages of the initiative. The solution is not to produce less. The solution is to build a system around production. Collection points can help organize harvest. Better handling can reduce bruising. Appropriate packaging can protect fruit during transportation. Faster links between farms and urban markets can give producers more time to sell before quality declines. International experience also shows why this matters. Studies of banana and plantain supply chains in other countries have documented substantial losses caused by poor handling, damaged fruit, transportation delays, and inadequate storage. Those figures should not be transferred directly to Burkina Faso because reliable national plantain loss data are not yet available. But the warning is relevant. A harvest that never reaches a consumer is not simply lost food. It represents wasted water, fertilizer, labor, transportation, and income. This changes how agricultural success should be measured. Producing twice as much plantain means little if a large portion is damaged, or farmers must accept extremely low prices because markets cannot absorb the harvest. The next stage of Burkina Faso's experiments therefore begins after production. The country must connect farmers to buyers while protecting the crop between the field and the market. And once that system begins working, another possibility emerges. Instead of racing against time to sell every plantain fresh, Burkina Faso can ask whether part of that harvest should be transformed into something that lasts longer and carries more value. Now, we arrive at the point where a plantain can become more than a piece of fruit. Consider two bunches harvested from neighboring farms. The first is carried to a local market and sold fresh. That transaction creates income for the farmer, transporter, and trader. The second enters a longer chain. It is collected, sorted, processed, packaged, transported, and eventually sold as a finished food product. Both began in Burkinabe soil, but the second can support more economic activity before reaching the consumer. Plantain can be processed into products such as chips, flour, dried foods, and puree. Some processing can begin at relatively modest scale. Burkina Faso would not necessarily need to start with an enormous industrial complex. A cooperative or local business could begin with smaller processing operations, provided there is enough reliable plantain supply and enough demand for the finished product. This possibility is not completely disconnected from the people already participating in Burkina Faso's plantain initiative. During the early stages of the program, representatives of producers discussed processing surplus plantain into flour. That becomes important when harvests grow. Instead of forcing every ripe bunch onto the fresh market at the same time, processing can give part of the crop another destination and potentially extend its commercial life. It can also create work beyond farming. Someone must collect the plantain, someone transports it, workers sort and prepare it, others operate processing equipment, package finished products, maintain machinery, manage distribution, and sell those products to consumers. 1 hectare of plantain can create work in a field. A plantain value chain can create work beyond the field. But processing should not become another political slogan. A factory without enough plantain will sit idle. A packaged product without customers will remain on shelves. Expensive equipment without trained workers, reliable electricity, maintenance, and quality control can become a burden rather than an asset. So the goal should not simply be to build factories. The goal is to build each link when the previous link is strong enough to support it. If Burkina Faso can do that, the value of its plantain will no longer end when farmers cut the bunches from their plants. More of that value can continue moving through Burkinabe hands. But the value of a plantain does not necessarily end with the fruit itself. After harvest, a large part of the plant remains behind. There are leaves, the pseudostem, peels from processing, and fruit that may be too damaged or irregular for the fresh market. In a poorly organized system, much of this material can simply become waste. In a more developed value chain, some of it may become another economic resource. The most practical opportunity begins with the soil. Plant residues contain organic material that can be returned to farmland through appropriate composting and soil management. For producers facing expensive agricultural inputs, using more locally available organic material could become one part of improving soil health. It will not eliminate the need for fertilizer, but it could reduce waste while returning useful material to production. There are other possibilities. Research from different banana producing countries has explored using suitable banana residues in animal feed. Banana pseudostems have also been studied as a source of fiber for ropes, packaging, bags, and other materials. Burkina Faso should not be presented as already operating these industries at large scale. There is no strong evidence that a national plantain byproduct industry currently exists. These are future possibilities that become more relevant only if production grows enough to provide a consistent supply of material. And this brings us back to the larger picture. Imagine a system that begins with nurseries inside Burkina Faso. Farmers receive healthy planting material. Irrigation keeps production stable. Harvests move through organized collection centers. Good fruit reaches fresh markets. Another portion enters local processing. Businesses turn it into flour, chips, dried products, or puree. Packaging, transportation, maintenance, and retail create additional work. Finally, some agricultural residues return to farms or find other productive uses. That is very different from simply counting how many plantain trees have been planted. Keeping value inside Burkina Faso does not mean refusing international trade or trying to produce everything alone. It means asking how many useful steps between the soil and the final customer can reasonably happen inside the country. The more productive links Burkina Faso can build competitively at home, the more opportunities one agricultural crop can create before its economic value finally leaves the chain. The plantain story also raises a larger question. What exactly is Ibrahim Traore's role in this transformation? He is not the farmer planting every seedling. He is not the technician managing irrigation, and he will not personally transport the harvest to market. His influence operates at another level. Traore has made food self-sufficiency a political priority and placed agricultural production within a broader idea of national sovereignty. Under his government, Burkina Faso has committed substantial resources to tractors, tillers, pumps, fertilizer, improved planting material, irrigation, and technical support. The 70,000 plantain seedlings belong inside that wider strategy. But there is another part of Traore's economic thinking that makes this experiment especially interesting. His government has repeatedly emphasized that Burkina Faso should not remain satisfied with producing raw materials while more profitable stages of processing take place elsewhere. Traore has publicly promoted the idea that products grown or produced in Burkina Faso should increasingly be transformed inside the country so that more value can be added locally. We can already see that philosophy appearing in other sectors. Burkina Faso has inaugurated tomato processing facilities, expanded vegetable oil production, and supported other domestic processing projects. These examples do not prove that a large plantain processing industry is coming next. No strong evidence currently shows that Traore has announced a major national plantain factory program. That distinction matters. The Plantain initiative is presently stronger as evidence of expanded domestic production than as evidence of completed industrialization. So the real test lies ahead. Can Burkina Faso connect these two parts of Traore's strategy? Can a crop first encourage for food self-sufficiency eventually become raw material for local businesses, local processing, and additional employment? If the answer is yes, then the significance of those original 70,000 seedlings changes. They would represent more than an attempt to grow food that Burkina Faso previously imported. They could become an early step toward an economy that tries to capture more stages between production and consumption. That is where Traore's influence should ultimately be judged, not by speeches or ceremonies, but by whether the institutions and investments created under his leadership can continue producing value after the political attention has moved elsewhere. There is another part of this story that requires careful separation between political conflict and agricultural reality. Burkina Faso's relationship with Western governments, especially France, has deteriorated sharply under Ibrahim Traore. European institutions have criticized his government over political freedoms, human rights, media restrictions, and the country's growing security relationship with Russia. Relations with France have become particularly hostile, but none of that proves that Western governments are fighting Burkina Faso because it distributed 70,000 plantain seedlings. There is no credible evidence that France, the European Union, or another Western government has publicly opposed this plantain program simply because Burkina Faso wants to produce more of its own food. In fact, the economic picture is more complicated. International financial institutions have continued supporting agricultural development in Burkina Faso. The World Bank approved a major agricultural transformation project designed to improve productivity, strengthen value chains, modernize processing and storage, improve market access, and create employment. The International Monetary Fund has also recognized that stronger agricultural production has supported Burkina Faso's economy while warning about serious vulnerabilities. Those warnings deserve attention. Burkina Faso remains exposed to climate shocks. Reliable water remains essential. Imported fertilizer and fuel can transmit international price increases directly into domestic farming costs. Farmers and agricultural businesses also need financing, infrastructure, technology, and dependable markets. These are more useful criticisms than pretending every challenge comes from a foreign enemy. Supporting Traore's effort to increase domestic production does not require believing every government program will succeed. Likewise, criticizing his government's political record does not automatically make local food production or domestic processing bad economic ideas. The plantain program should therefore be judged by measurable results. Are farmers earning sustainable incomes? Are yields improving? Are losses after harvest falling? Is local production replacing some imports without making food unnecessarily expensive? Can private businesses and cooperatives profitably process part of the harvest? And can those gains survive without permanent emergency support from the state? Those questions move the discussion beyond political loyalty, because in the end, neither praise from supporters nor criticism from foreign capitals will determine whether this agricultural strategy works. The farmers, markets, costs, harvests, and businesses of Burkina Faso will. The lesson from Burkina Faso is not that 70,000 plantain seedlings have already transformed a nation. The lesson is that agricultural sovereignty must eventually be measured by what happens after those seedlings enter the ground. For other African countries, several principles stand out. First, look at foods people already consume and import, then ask which of them can be produced competitively at home. Second, never distribute planting material without planning for water, fertilizer, technical support, and reliable infrastructure. Third, Do not wait until harvest day to discover that farmers have nowhere to sell. And fourth, processing must follow economic reality. A small operation producing plantain flour or chips may sometimes make more sense than an expensive factory operating far below capacity. Most importantly, keeping value in Africa does not mean closing Africa to the world. Burkina Faso can trade internationally, obtain technology, attract investment, and cooperate with outside institutions while still trying to ensure that more farming, processing, employment, and business activity happens at home. That principle extends beyond Burkina Faso. It matters across Mali, Niger, West Africa, and the wider Sahel. Leaders including Ibrahim Traore, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahmane Tiani will ultimately be judged not simply by declarations of sovereignty, but by whether ordinary people experience lasting economic gains. The same standard should guide debates involving France, the African Union, and the wider international community. African news should not be reduced to choosing heroes and enemies. Results matter. Years from now, the questions should be simple. How many of these farms remain productive? Did farmers earn more? Did domestic supply reduce imports? Were post-harvest losses reduced? Did processing create sustainable jobs? And did more economic value remain in Burkina Faso? Those answers will tell us whether this was merely a plantain program or one small beginning of something larger. Africa's agricultural transformation will not be proven when a seedling is handed to a farmer. It will be proven when the harvest supports families, businesses, skills, and industries long after it leaves the field. If you believe these are the African stories worth following, subscribe and share your view on what Burkina Faso should build next. We sincerely appreciate your time and support. Every video on this channel is carefully researched, thoughtfully written, and meticulously edited by our dedicated team. We don't rely on automated production or shortcuts to create our content. Every story, every visual, and every detail is crafted with genuine care, passion, and a commitment to bringing you meaningful, high-quality videos.